Hi guys, Geechu64 here, and today I want to talk about dark storytelling in Star Trek. Now, I've made no secret about my dislike of New Trek and its dark dystopian setting. From Discovery and now Picard, New Trek is filled with extremely dark tones. Tones that I do not believe fit this franchise. And as has been mentioned to me on more than one occasion, the Deep Space Nine was the same way. It was a dark show, and that is true. So in this video, I'll address why I think the darker stories in Deep Space Nine worked, and the darker stories in New Trek do not. I hope you guys are ready for the truth.
Oh, geek.
True. 64.
Geek. Truth.
Geek. True. 64. Oh, shit.
Thank you for joining me today. I will preface with this. If you are enjoying New Trek, that is great. If you hate New Trek, that is great. This video is not to take away anyone's enjoyment. I just want to address why I believe DS9 works and New Trek does not, since several people have drawn a comparison between these two. So that being said, here's reason number one. Fitting into established universe. So what do I mean by this? Well, Deep Space Nine premiered on January 3rd, 1993, during the Next Generation's 6th season. In the opening episode, we have Picard meet Sisko. We established that Sisko lost his wife during an attack with the Borg, an attack that happened while Picard was assimilated by the Borg in Season 3 and was forced to help him. So, Sisko blames Picard. We get a contrast between these two leaders, not only in who they are, but how they handle situations. As Q pointed out in the first season of DS9, Sisko is not Picard.
You hit me. Picard never hit me.
I'm not Picard.
Indeed not. You're much easier to provoke. How fortunate for me.
This sets the tone early on that while this show is Star Trek, it is going to have a different feel than TNG. DS9 is further tied to the overall universe, with Quark showing up in the 7th season of TNG. The transporter Clone Riker from TNG also shows up on DS9. The Duras sisters show up, and as mentioned earlier, Q and Vosh from TNG show up here. Granted, these crossovers happened earlier in the show's run before it really truly found its identity, but this tied DS9 to the established universe. And when Voyager premiered on January 16th, 1995, its very first episode was then docked with DS9. Quark once again appears in this crossover as well. Worf, a main character from TNG, becomes a main character in the last few seasons of DS9. All these things tie DS9 to the overarching universe. Because of this, it feels like Trek, even when being dark. It sets a contrast to what the other Trek shows were, but it still fits. It still feels like it belongs. New Trek doesn't really fit. It has no contrast or real identity, but it pretends that it does. Now, when J.J. Abrams rebooted Star Trek in the 2009 film, he introduced the idea of parallel timeline.
An alternate reality.
Precisely. Whatever our lives might have been if the time continuum was disrupted, our destinies have changed.
Not unlike the Mirror Universe, a timeline that would allow him to take the franchise in a different direction without destroying what came before. The original timeline is still out there. So say what you want about Abrams, but to me this was a smart move. It allowed him freedom to do what he wanted without insulting Trek fans. Now, there are many reasons why this change had to happen from a business perspective as well, but I don't want to get into the weeds too much with this. Suffice to say, Trek was required to be different than what was established because of the Viacom split into two companies, splitting the rights to Trek. Again, I'm not going to get into the weeds with that. There's lots of content out there if you want to check it out. But when Discovery was announced, fans were told that it was a prequel that fit into the established original canon of Trek. However, when the series premiered, it became clear that this series was tied more to J.J. Abrams films. From the aesthetics of the ships and the lens flares to the Orc Cleon redesign, history is even rewritten, with the character of Michael Burnham now being an adopted sister to Spock. Now, because of this, Discovery feels completely separate to established Trek. It doesn't tie in. It has nothing to contrast with because it's very much its own thing. It ties into nothing. Now, at the time of this video, Picard is still airing its first season. And in many ways, Picard is even worse at this. Now, you would think that Picard would tie into TNG in some way, which could be a good opportunity to contrast these two shows and tie them together, but everything in this show feels more like Discovery. Its aesthetics, its tone, and dystopian outlook, which we'll dive more to here in a second, but Picard, like Discovery, feels separate from Star Trek. They don't fit into anything. Remove the name Trek from the title and rename the aliens, I think most people would have a hard time identifying these two shows as Star Trek. Number 2, a utopian future. This is arguably my main point to make here. The idea of a utopian future is what makes Star Trek unique. It is what sets it apart from other sci-fi. It is based on a foundation that humanity has evolved far past the problems of today. The future of Trek is based on the idea that everyone is trying to better themselves as individuals. Deep Space Nine challenged this point in many episodes, but it never crossed the line. In the Pale Moonlight is one of the best episodes of Deep Space Nine, in which Sisko, through deception, tries to force the Romulans into aiding the Federation in the Dominion War, in which the Federation is currently losing and will lose without the Romulans' help. In the end, someone ends up dying because of this whole plan, and Sisko struggles with his decisions here.
And you'll get what you want, a war between the Romulans and the Dominion. And if your conscience is bothering you, you should soothe it with the knowledge that you may have just saved the entire Alpha Quadrant.
On another hand, Chief O'Brien deals with his hatred for Cardassians because of past wars that he's fought against them. At times, he has a hard time looking past his feelings to judge the person for who they are. In one episode, we see a group of Starfleet officers on the front lines of the Dominion War. They've been on the ground for months, constantly fighting a race that can go invisible, the Jem'Hadar. They are low on rations, supplies, and manpower. They're psychologically broken in many respects, suffering from PTSD. Quark comments on humans here.
They're a wonderful, friendly people, as long as their bellies are full and their holosuites are working. But take away their creature comforts. Deprive them of food, sleep, sonic showers. Put their lives in jeopardy over an extended period of time, and those same friendly, intelligent, wonderful people will become as nasty and as violent as the most bloodthirsty Klingon.
Also, Section 31 is introduced in Deep Space Nine. It's a covert organization outside of Starfleet, so mysterious that no one has ever heard of them or admits to their existence. Almost the entire organization is represented by Sloan, making you wonder if this is an organization or if it's just one man. You really have no idea. But even with the threat of total annihilation by the Dominion, these people maintain the idea of an evolved humanity. The threats to that progress come from outside, but in the end, humanity is represented in a positive way. Both Starfleet and the Federation are represented in a positive way. Everyone embraces their difference. Everyone is on equal footing. Only their strength of character and accomplishments differentiate them. That's Star Trek, guys. New Trek has no such nuance. Its darker tone does not challenge its utopian future, it overpowers it. It changes the core of Trek in order to tell its darker stories. A utopian society does not exist in New Trek.
Sheer hubris.
Most of these characters are nihilistic and hateful, and it makes you wonder why these people want to be explorers in the first place. I don't know if this is due to the writer's own pessimistic attitude being forced into the stories they're telling, or if it's just ineptitude at showing a positive future that is challenged from the outside. Again, Star Trek Picard is a prime example of this. Seven of Nine is one of my favorite Trek characters, and she's just made into a revenge murder machine in one of the latest episodes of Star Trek Picard. They brutally murder Ichep, another character from Voyager, as a simple revenge plot device. It's the only purpose he serves. The larger story being told in Picard is about the Federation and Starfleet isolating themselves and abandoning the galaxy, running completely opposite to what Trek is. They use androids as slave labor and now ban them from society. On Earth, there's a character named Rafi who belittles Picard for living on a vineyard while she lives in a trailer in the desert, as if there's some monetary reasoning for this. There is no money in human society and hasn't been for hundreds of years.
That's what all this is about. A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We have eliminated hunger, want, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy.
And ironically, a show called Discovery does little discovering of anything, spending an entire first season fighting Orc Cleons and mirror universe doppelgangers. There's just no fun or betterment of humanity in New Trek to offset the darker tones. The darker tones permeate every aspect of New Trek. No positive future is allowed, making it just like every other sci-fi show out there. Love it or hate it, New Trek is not Shrek. It has thrown away the unique utopian future, and in its place stands this dark, cynical Blade Runner style future that is just not Star Trek. Number 3, likable characters. I somewhat talked about this earlier, but let's elaborate. While Deep Space Nine has very dark characters like Garrick, the castaway Cardassian tailor who may or may not have been a spy, he manages to get the audience to like him, even when he does truly questionable and despicable things that run contrary to Starfleet in every way. Or Quark, who runs an illegal operation outside of his bar throughout the entire show, seemingly caring very little outside of profit, yet he has many standout episodes where he actually does sacrifice a lot for others. He is also very often a comedic voice when things get too dark in the show. Odo's journey is cool. Dax is a cool character with multiple lifetimes due to her alien species. O'Brien has many demons, but he's also raising a family and learning to tackle those things. Major Kira is possibly the most interesting character in the show, having struggled her entire life spent in war. Now she's struggling to be a politician and a leader and deal with the same people that she fought against previously in like a political setting. And of course, Sisko, who is arguably the most multifaceted Trek captain. Actually, I won't even say arguably. He is the most multifaceted Trek captain, commanding a room with ease, joking 1 minute and stern the next. DS9 had great, likable characters that gave stakes to the darker moments, that made us care when things got grim. They also had connections to one another. Anytime things got too seriously, someone was there with to comfort the other characters or to make a joke to lighten the tone.
If I'm not back within 78 hours, I want you to take that rod and eat it.
Eat it? You're joking.
Yes, Doctor, I am.
Very funny.
Well, I thought so.
In New Trek, these characters have very little connection. Discovery is the worst offender in my opinion, as it keeps its focus on Michael Burnham most of the time. So if you don't like that character, there really aren't any other characters to latch onto in the series. Even when other characters are shown, they seem to have a general lack of mistrust of one another and just a weird emotion to them, like they aren't real people.
Guys, this is so cool.
It is cool.
So sorry.
This is not a crew that really likes each other, which makes it hard for the audience to like them. Whether it's characters like Tilly, who just don't even remotely fit the Starfleet mold, or Stamets, a lead engineer that has a general distaste for most people. He's very antisocial, or a captain that is purposely written to be evil. The dark tone of this show is reflected in almost every character, and there's no relief from it. Star Trek Picard is shaping up to be much the same, with a very two-dimensional android scientist. She kills her friend, or Rafi, belittling Picard while abandoning her family, I guess, and she's addicted to drugs. So there's not a whole lot of substance to these characters. And as I said before, 7 of 9 shows up just to murder people. All the ways you could take this character, and that's what you do. The only character to care about in Star Trek Picard is Picard, and that is because the character is already established. But even then, it's hard to get into because he inhabits a universe that isn't Trek. His famous speeches and leadership rendered irrelevant in such a dark place. Levity is attempted at times in New Trek, but it's through one-liners and F-bombs. It is extremely superficial when they try and break the dark tones.
I'm going, get off my ass. Sir, get off my ass, sir.
Without likable characters, a darker story feels even darker and worse so, pointless. Number 4, writing quality. This may seem obvious, but there is a clear quality difference between DS9 and New Trek. DS9 tackled all of its darker stories and tones from an outside perspective, and from an internal one with the characters. The darker tones were a result of a human perspective on what was happening. For instance, one of my favorite episodes was in Season 4, where O'Brien is falsely accused of a crime and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but the prison is in his mind and only a few moments pass in reality. He has to deal with what happened, and it affects all aspects of his life, his job, his family. He is a changed man.
I'm not the man I used to be. I'm dangerous. I nearly hit Molly today. All she wanted was a little attention. And I nearly hit her. But you didn't.
This is a dark story written from a human perspective. Also, the Dominion War throughout DS9 is represented through political maneuvering and alliances. It's not too dissimilar to early Game of Thrones. DS9 kept a bigger picture of the war at all times while focusing on how it affected our characters. And this was all due to great writing. While New Trek relies a lot on explosions and special effects, it's about who has more ships, it's about who has better tech. It isn't really interested in interplanetary relations on anything other than a very superficial level, or really focusing on the inner turmoil of its characters in anything other than a superficial way. While this form of storytelling can be enjoyable to the average viewer, it doesn't feel Trek. While not every episode of Trek is top tier, most of DS9's episodes were anchored by an amazing writing staff. It was nominated for 2 Hugo Awards for The Visitor, which is one of my favorite episodes. I love that one. And Trials and Tribulations, which was just a great fun time travel story that tied Deep Space Nine all the way back to Shatner and Spock in the original series. There are no such standout episodes in New Trek. The writing is just not at the same level. Number 5, episodic format. This is something that has been lost in New Trek. The episodic format is what Trek was founded on. And while I do believe there is a version of Trek that could exist out there that could be more serialized, the core of Trek has to be rooted in individual stories, a new planet and a new adventure every couple episodes. Deep Space Nine had an overarching storyline of Bajor and the Cardassians, which evolved even further with the Dominion War onto a greater scale, but that show never let those storylines run it over. There's plenty of standout episodes here to be contained within 42-minute runtime in Deep Space Nine. Some of my favorite episodes were The Visitor, Far Beyond the Stars, Trials and Tribulations, The Magnificent Ferengi, and Children of Time, to name a few of my favorite self-contained episodes. New Trek is going the way of most shows over the last decade, focusing on serialized storytelling. However, that does not work for all shows. Stories that should be one episode or maybe a two-parter are stretched out to fill a whole season, which I think is one of the main problems in Star Trek Picard in particular. The ideas presented are not enough to fill out a season, making episodes feel inconsequential. There can be no standout episodes because they all just run together. With original Trek, if there was an episode you didn't care for, which does happen, I don't love every single episode of all the Trek shows, okay? If there was an episode I didn't care about, there would always be a completely new story next week, next episode. New Trek traps you into its very singular, one-set, one-tone story. So if you don't like the story that they're telling, then you don't like the series as a whole, which is exactly what's happening in my case. I do not like the stories being told in New Trek at all. And those are 5 reasons why Deep Space Nine works with its darker elements and New Trek does not. I actually had more reasons and topics I wanted to discuss, so if this video does well, I will have a follow-up video explaining more in depth about New Trek versus original Trek, or the Orville versus New Trek. Again, I want to say that if you like New Trek, that's great. Everyone has different opinions, and hopefully this gives you a better idea of where I'm coming from and why most Trek fans are just not on board with New Trek. I find these essay style videos the best way to get my reasoning across. And my channel this year will put more focus on essay style, higher quality videos than what I've done in the past. So I'm excited to share that with you guys. I got a lot of cool projects coming up, and I want to thank you guys for watching. Thank you for giving me your time. Thank you subscribers for being awesome. And if you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and share. Do all the YouTube stuff or don't. I'm not a beggar. I'm Geechu64, and I'll always tell you the truth.